This is
Question,
James.
sir.
Yeah.
How do we know that the original paper's not in a private collector's home somewhere?
Yeah. There's no way of knowing, it's true. And it remains to be seen. And I'm sure there are people that are looking. There was something in the paper today that, you know, the original printed document about the independence of Haiti just turned up. Independence of Haiti was just discovered by a grad student in London in the National Archives. So these things turn up. But one reason people tend not to hold their breath is it's pretty rare to find Elizabethan play scripts. Partly because paper was really expensive in 1590 and 1600. Mostly it was handmade in France. And once you were through with it, once a play was set into type, you didn't need the first draft. People didn't collect manuscripts. Even in the 1700s, it was rare, which is why that cartoon was making fun of the antiquarians in the chamber club. So when you're through with a manuscript or any paper, you would have to reuse it. Maybe line a pie tin or stiffen a bookbinder. And somebody 20 years ago, I think, was rebinding an old 1588 copy of The Odyssey by Homer. And it was falling apart, so they pulled it apart. Inside the binding, they found 2 pages of a play from probably about 1588. And it looked a lot like the tavern scene in Henry IV, Part 1. So Hamlet could be inside an old, you know, first edition King James Bible. But who's going to tear apart the Bible looking at it? Anyway, Boswell, this is, you know, Samuel Johnson's biographer. He looked at that manuscript. I don't know how much of it he could read, but he got down on his knees and kissed the topmost page and said, "I shall now die contented, that I have lived to see this day." And you have to picture the scene. The papers were only visible in the Ireland home by lamplight. It was probably pretty dark. The pages were dark. The ink was faded because it was actually watered down. People didn't know what they were seeing, but they just felt like, oh, this looks like Shakespeare. But they weren't being literary analysts. This is Richard Brinsley Sheridan. He was the most famous playwright of the day, also part owner of the Drury Lane Theatre Royal. He really wanted to stage this play, Vortigern and Rowena, which is a history play. And he competed with others and won the rights to stage it. He was deeply in debt. He had just expanded the theater. He was a gambler, he was a drunk, very flamboyant member of Parliament, and he figured, he didn't even like Shakespeare, but he figured this play, which was actually controversial. Not everyone believed it was real. People didn't know what to think, but everyone was talking about it. He figured it would fill the house night after night, and then he could pay back the expense that he spent in vastly expanding the theater, which was the biggest theater in England with 3,500 seats. And he cast in the lead role of King Vortigern, John Philip Kemble, who was the most famous Shakespearean actor in England. This is the role that made him famous was Hamlet a few years before. And he was a very regal man, kind of pompous, and probably the closest thing in England to a living emperor. And this is Kemble in repose, quite an impressive figure. Kemble, however, even before seeing the play, was suspicious. He didn't think this sounded right. And he was a friend of Edmund Malone, who was the most famous Shakespearean editor and scholar in the 1790s. Malone knew it was a forgery right away, without looking at the papers. He just didn't give it a chance. And sort of poisoned Kemble's mind, which is too bad, because he was going to play the lead role in this play. So this is Mrs. Sidney, Sarah Sidney. She was the greatest Shakespearean actress of the day. In her casual clothes. She was Kemble's sister. They often played, you know, the king and queen together, as they would in this play. And the third lead was Dorothy Jordan. Mrs. Jordan. She was a younger actress who was not a great actress, not a great Shakespearean certainly, but she was the favorite of the gallery gods, the people sitting in the back in the cheap seats. And the theater was a place where everyone came. The theater was the mass medium entertainment of the late 1700s. Everybody went. Everybody talked about what was at the theater. They treated actors and actresses as celebrities. Unlike Shakespeare's day, women couldn't even be actors because it was considered like prostitution to be on stage. Now she was somebody who could we be quicker? This is the same role. She's actually dressed as a warrior queen. That's a military headdress, believe it or not. One reason she was so popular is she's wearing men's tights. She was famous for her cross-dressing roles. This was about the only public occasion Georgian gentlemen had to see a shapely woman in tight clothes. And she was the mistress of the Duke of Clarence. And here she is studying her lines while they go on promenade with some of their 10 children. She lived with the Duke of Clarence, one of the sons of King George III, future King William IV. And she really believed in the play. She was sure it was Shakespeare. She was delighted to be cast in the role of the king's daughter. And the Duke also believed in it. He ordered 7 copies of the forthcoming bound edition of the papers, which Samuel Ireland rushed into print over his son's objections. Because Samuel wanted to make some money from these papers. And one volume was 4 guineas, 4 pounds, 4 shillings, which is about what a working man earned in 2 months. He bought 7. He ended up leaving her, by the way, and the 10 children, marrying a princess from the continent before he became king. This is the poem you have. Is there in heaven aught more there? And it's a little hard to see what it says. This is from the miscellaneous papers, which is what Samuel called the book he brought out in Christmas time, 1795. And hundreds of people bought it. The Prime Minister bought a copy, earls, dukes, bishops, all sorts of dignitaries. And it's worth understanding that what a critic or a scholar thought was a lot less important to the average Englishman or Englishwoman than what an aristocrat thought. So if a duke said, I think this is real, that carried a lot of weight, even though it seems kind of silly to us today. This is the example of what you have. And actually, even though it seems silly, to say there on earth a man more true than literally Shakespeare is to you, it's actually pretty hard to detect forgery just on stylistic grounds. And look at the Hitler diaries, where you had examples of Hitler's handed writing, and experts testified it was authentic. Or the Howard Hughes hoax in the 1970s. There are lots of examples of what Howard Hughes wrote, and people weren't sure. And with Shakespeare now, there's still arguments going on about anonymous sonnets that were printed in, say, 1600. And people look at them and they feed them through computer programs to study the verb patterns, and there's no way to know. You can't just look at something and say, it's sheer genius, it must be Shakespeare, or it's boring, it couldn't be. Because has anyone here ever read The Rape of Lucrece by Shakespeare? It's an epic poem. He was better known for his epic poems than for any play while he was alive. And it's tough going, it really is. It's long-winded, it's sensational, it's about the prelude to a rape and the aftermath of a rape. It was very popular, it sold really well. And I tried to read it, I couldn't. I got the book on tape, Richard Burton reading it, which made it worse. But I think sometimes we talk about Shakespeare a little unthinkingly, about how great he is, as though there's something in each verse that just jumps out at you. So that's a way of defending a forger. I mean, people later wrote about this as silly, but they're writing after they knew the boy had confessed. At the time, it was pretty tough to know, and it was also dangerous for a critic to come out and denounce papers that might later prove to be Shakespeare's. That would not only be embarrassing, it would be a sacrilege, it would be blasphemy, because you would have denounced a god. So people mostly kept their heads down. This was a critic named James Bodden, the editor of a newspaper called The Oracle, reading that poem that was there in heaven on where he said he detected the utmost of delicacy and poetical passion. So he regretted that. And not one group of people that weren't worried about sticking their necks out were newspaper editors in general. So there were no parodies published before things had come to a head and there was still complete uncertainty. This was actually a critic named Richard Porson. Published this as a letter to the editor in one of the morning newspapers in London in 1796. He signed himself S. England instead of S. Ireland, in case people didn't get the joke. And he said he had just discovered the lost tragedies of Sophocles, a little trunk. And he published them. There's they are in Greek, this one stands up. And here it is translated in Latin. And I don't speak Latin. It says, 3 children sliding on the ice, one fell in. This is another loose thing. It's sort of a nonsense nursery rhyme. But it's pretending Sophocles wrote it. So. But people didn't really care. It was, people made fun of it, but the newspapers were always, like today in England, they made fun of anybody. They would trash someone just for being Catholic. Or for visiting France. This was one critic, one of the 2 main Shakespeare critics. This is George Stevens. And he knew without looking that the plays and the papers were forgeries. And he spread the word, but he wasn't about to put his own name on it. And he influenced some other critics who started to ask questions. But the villain of the story, even though he was right, but certainly the bête noire of the Ireland family was Edmund Malone. And he dropped what he was doing. He was supposed to be working on a biography of Shakespeare. It was going to be the biography. He never did write it, partly because he threw himself into about half a year of analyzing these papers, and then finally published a 424-page expose. It was supposed to be a pamphlet, it kept getting bigger. And he published it 2 days before the premiere of the play. This is Malone's edition of Shakespeare's complete plays, published in 1790. And he also has Greek and Latin, in case you're wondering if he's a learned man. He's very learned man. His readers are learned man. And just 6 days, 5 or 6 days after this book was published, in the winter of 1796, which included this forgery. It's an acknowledgement of a payment of £5, a repaid debt from Shakespeare, John Hemming, his friend and fellow actor. William Henry, again, wrote it with his left hand. It looks like a pile of string. And then 5 days after this was published for everyone to see, a neighbor and friend of the Irelands discovered a deed with the 5th signature of Shakespeare ever found and the 1st signature of John Hemming ever found. And you go back over here. Okay. Well, anyway, it's very regular, like calligraphy. No, it's okay. Yeah. I mean, there's no connection. So the neighbor ran up to the Ireland and said, the papers are a forgery, I can tell. Look at this, they don't match. And if one paper was a forgery, they were all a forgery. And William Henry came up with a story. He said, oh, Mr. H says that's tall John Hemming. You're thinking of short John Hemming. There were 2 John Hemmings, both knew Shakespeare. And people bought it because they saw what they wanted to see. They wanted to believe the papers were real. And they wanted to believe that Shakespeare loved his wife. They wanted to believe he paid back a debt to a friend in exactly 30 days, even though the idea that 2 friends, one borrowing £5, would like write a little accounting thing about this £5 loan.